Today, we're diving into 5 terrifying caving disasters, all caused by human error. No cave-ins, no flash floods, just one bad choice. And the Earth didn't give them a second chance. The first one in particular is about an instructor making a fatal assumption, putting not only his own life in danger, but also the 12 other kids alongside him. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On April 9th, 2005, 20-year-old Richard Hears led an expedition deep into one of the most infamous caves in the Ozark Mountains, Devil's Den Cave. 12 eager children, ages 8 to 12, were counting on him to guide their school field trip safely through the twisting limestone passages. Instructor Richard was confident from prior visits, believed he was ready for the challenge, but that confidence would soon be tested in ways he never imagined. The day started cool outside, around 20 degrees Celsius, but as the group descended into the cave, the temperature dropped to a steady 13 degrees Celsius. The cool air inside the limestone maze would gradually sap their body heat over the hours to come. None of the children had been in a wild cave before, only commercial show caves with paved paths and electric lights. Now they were stepping into raw nature, far from the safety of well-lit tourist routes. Richard carried a small backpack filled with essentials: water bottles, energy bars, a first aid kit, and extra flashlight batteries. He had planned the trip to last about 3 hours. What he hadn't fully reckoned with was the physical change he had undergone since his last exploration 6 months earlier. A 15-pound weight gain that now made squeezing through the cave's narrowest sections far more difficult. By 11:30 a.m., the group had pushed through a series of increasingly tight horizontal tunnels. The children's smaller frames allowed them to maneuver more easily, while Richard had to exhale deeply and twist his body just to fit. Each successful crawl through the confined passages gave a false sense of security. Their next challenge was a vertical fissure known as the fissure, a crack about 10 inches 25 centimeters wide and 6 feet 1.8 meters tall, connecting 2 horizontal sections of the cave. Beyond the fissure lay a slightly larger tunnel Richard had explored before, which he mentally referred to as a room. It was this passage that promised more spectacular cave formations and easier movement. Richard made a crucial decision. He would send the children through the fissure first, while supervising from behind, then follow himself to close the group. The kids, wide-eyed but excited, turned sideways and began squeezing through the narrow slot one by one. Their small bodies compressed as they pressed against the cold limestone, some groaning quietly from discomfort. All 12 children emerged safely on the other side, crawling forward into the larger tunnel with their flashlights sweeping the dark ceiling and walls. Richard turned sideways and began his entry into the fissure, but immediately he realized something was wrong. The stone gripped him far tightly than before, pressing his chest against one side and his spine against the other. Inch by inch, he tried to push forward, pulling in his stomach, but halfway through the passage, he came to an immovable stop. The fissure had narrowed slightly, just enough that his hips, wider than his chest, could not fit. He attempted to reverse course, but found himself caught at an awkward angle. The rock held him like a vice, compressing his chest and restricting his breathing. Panic surged. He was stuck, trapped in solid limestone, with 12 children on the other side out of reach. The weight of responsibility crashed down on him. The children, once filled with adventure, now stared in horror through the narrow gap as their protector was pinned helplessly in stone. Some froze in shock, others cried silently, and the older kids crawled closer to assess the situation. Outside, Melissa Jones, another instructor, waited calmly for her group's turn later in the day, unaware that beneath her feet, a nightmare was unfolding. The planned return time was 3 p.m., nearly 3 hours away. She checked her watch occasionally, but saw nothing to raise an alarm. Inside, the first 30 minutes blurred with Richard's desperate struggles to free himself. The tighter he pushed, the more firmly the rock held him. His breath became shallow gasps, and the children watched helplessly as his strength waned. Cold seeped into their bones. The cave's steady 12 Celsius air robbed them of warmth. Richard instructed the children to huddle close to conserve heat, but the physical toll was mounting. Circulation in Richard's legs began to fail. Tingling and numbness signaled the onset of compression syndrome, a dangerous condition caused by prolonged pressure cutting off blood flow. After 2 hours, the air quality worsened. Oxygen levels dropped while carbon dioxide increased, causing headaches, dizziness, and nausea among the group. Dehydration loomed as their limited water supply dwindled. By 3 p.m., when the group was due back, Melissa's concern grew. She alerted park rangers who began a search deep into the cave system. When rescuers finally reached them, the scene was dire. Richard was weak and trapped, his legs suspended and numbed below the fisher's grip. The children were frightened and shivering, some showing early signs of hypothermia. Initial rescue efforts lacked proper training. Park rangers and firefighters, armed with sledgehammers and chisels, tried breaking rock to free Richard. The hammer blows echoed through the cave, risking collapse. One ranger broke his hand, underscoring the dangers of improvisation in tight spaces. 2 hours later, Washington County's specialized cave rescue team arrived. They immediately changed tactics, focusing on Richard rather than the rock. Using climbing-grade tubular webbing, the team fashioned slings under Richard's arms and carefully lifted him slightly higher, where the fissure widened marginally. They also cut away his bulky jeans, reducing his size in the crack. After 5 grueling hours trapped in unyielding stone, Richard was finally freed. The sudden return of blood flow caused intense pain, like thousands of needles stabbing simultaneously. The rescue team then focused on evacuating the children. Methodically, one by one, they carried the young explorers back through the fissure and out of the cave. Outside, medical teams treated the children for hypothermia and shock. 2 of the youngest were rushed to the hospital, but fortunately, all survived without lasting physical harm. Richard, physically exhausted and mentally shaken, left the cave under his power, but the ordeal left deep scars, both physical and psychological. For the children, the trauma of being trapped beyond reach, witnessing their guide pinned helplessly in stone, would haunt them for years, manifesting in nightmares and lingering fear. But some caves don't twist or collapse. They lure you in with crystal water and silence, until the pressure crushes your mind from the inside.
On May 11, 1990, in the remote wilderness of Hernando County, Florida, the still waters of Diepolder Springs No. 2 hid a labyrinth few dared to explore. Beneath the surface stretched one of the state's most treacherous underwater cave systems, where light vanished quickly, and pressure wrapped around the human body like an invisible fist. 25-year-old Michael Spears knelt at the edge, checking every strap and valve on his gear. He was ambitious, focused, new to the sport, but with an edge of determination that masked his inexperience. Just 5 months earlier, he'd earned his cave diving certification, and already, he'd logged 75 dives. The alien world beneath the surface fascinated him, gliding weightlessly through flooded rock tunnels, squeezing through tight restrictions, and moving into echoing caverns untouched by daylight. Tonight, he would attempt his most dangerous dive yet. A few feet away, Daniel was checking his own equipment with the steady, methodical rhythm of experience. At 34, he was the senior diver, over a decade in the sport, and fully aware that confidence in a cave could turn lethal in seconds. Michael had never dived this particular sinkhole before. The lower circuit was known among cave divers for its depth, complexity, and its ability to turn silent and deadly with just a little stirred-up silt. But Michael wasn't deterred. He was eager to prove himself, to go as deep as the veterans, to show he belonged. The rain had muddied the water, but they both pressed forward. Daniel asked him, "Last check. You good?" Michael nodded, biting down on his regulator. "Yeah, let's do this." They descended slowly into the mouth of the sink, passing through a narrow entrance restriction that opened into the main cavern. Their lights cut thin beams through the swirling sediment. Visibility was poor, even by cave diving standards. Every kick of a fin clouded the space like an underwater dust storm. Still, they maneuvered with care, hugging the guideline, the thin, essential rope connecting them to the outside world. In a cave like Diepolder Springs, losing contact with the line could mean disorientation, panic, and death. The water cleared slightly at the upper circuit line, revealing vast underwater rock formations like the ruins of some sunken cathedral. Here they exchanged the universal "OK" hand signal. Michael felt good, confident. He adjusted his buoyancy and prepared to descend deeper into the lower circuit. Past 200 feet, everything changed. The water grew darker, colder. Breathing became heavier. At this depth, nitrogen narcosis, the so-called rapture of the deep, began to set in. It creeps into the diver's mind like alcohol, clouding judgment, dulling reflexes, and eroding awareness. Most divers start to feel it around 130 feet. At 200 feet and beyond, it becomes unpredictable and dangerous. As they pushed deeper into the circuit, Daniel noticed Michael drifting.
At first it was subtle, just a few feet below the guideline. Then Michael surged downward more rapidly, his movements jerky and impulsive. Daniel reached out, trying to signal him, but Michael pressed ahead, slipping deeper and deeper into the system. Daniel's concern turned sharp. They were nearing 250 feet, dangerous territory, even for seasoned professionals. The circuit would soon loop back to the junction room, where they'd hit the silt-heavy zone again. But before they could turn back, disaster struck.
Visibility collapsed. A thick cloud of disturbed silt rolled through the water, swallowing their lights and turning the cave into a pitch-black void. Daniel lost sight of Michael instantly. In the chaos, Michael reached for the guideline, missed. Tried again, missed again. Panic bloomed. Disoriented and under the influence of nitrogen narcosis, he turned the wrong way. Instead of heading toward the exit, he went deeper into the cave. Michael's heart pounded as he spun in the blackness. He saw what looked like a rope floating in the distance and swam toward it, hoping for salvation. He didn't realize he was following a false lead into the downstream ballroom, a remote, isolated chamber far from the main route. The deeper he went, the harder it became to breathe. His body was overheating with exertion. Carbon dioxide began building in his bloodstream, a side effect of overbreathing at depth. It worsened his narcosis and blurred the edges of his vision. His regulator delivered air, but it couldn't stop the blackout that was coming. With each breath, his coordination failed. His buoyancy faltered. Slowly, his body tilted forward, the weight of his gear dragging him down. He lost consciousness before he ever touched the bottom. Back near the junction room, Daniel had already begun his ascent. He couldn't see Michael anywhere. Every instinct told him something was wrong. But at those depths, there's no such thing as a quick return. He had to stop multiple times at decompression stages to allow the nitrogen in his blood to safely escape. Skipping those stops would risk decompression sickness, the bends, where gas bubbles form inside the body, causing joint pain, paralysis, or worse. At 30 feet, Daniel hovered, scanning the water below. Nothing. By the time he surfaced, other divers were arriving. They prepared to re-enter the system and follow the guidelines back into the depths. But there was no sign of Michael. The next morning, a full recovery operation began. Diepolder Springs was deep, complex, and silty. It was no place for amateurs. A team of elite recovery divers, decompression experts, and support crew assembled. Each diver knew the risks. The operation would be long, cold, and dangerous. The first team descended, tracing the guideline carefully. They moved in slow, deliberate patterns, watching every movement to avoid stirring the silt. At 200 feet, they switched to specialized gas mixtures. Their dive computers tracked every metric: depth, air, and decompression stops. Time stretched as they swept the cave. At last, at 241 feet, one diver's light struck something still on the cave floor. Michael lay motionless, face down, arms relaxed, regulator still in his mouth. His mask was intact, no signs of a struggle. It was clear he had blacked out quietly, his body shutting down before he even realized he was in danger. His oxygen tank still had air. He hadn't run out of gas. He had simply made a fatal error at the worst possible depth. It took 7 hours to bring him home. Everyone already knew what the outcome would be, but confirmation still hit hard. Michael Spears was gone. He had been young, talented, and full of potential, perhaps too eager. Experts reviewed the dive and agreed on the likely cause: nitrogen narcosis, compounded by carbon dioxide buildup, and a final disorienting blackout. The critical error was losing the guideline. Had Michael used a trimix gas setup, oxygen, nitrogen, and helium, the effects of narcosis might have been less severe, but he had relied on compressed air, which becomes dangerously intoxicating beyond 200 feet. In the end, it wasn't one single mistake that cost him his life. It was a cascade of small misjudgments, magnified by the silent, merciless nature of the deep. Diepolder Springs had claimed another life, and the cave, as always, kept its secrets. But not every descent ends in death. Sometimes, it ends in something even rarer: a second chance. Jackson Blue Spring in Florida is one of the most revered sites in the world of cave diving. A pristine, clear spring, hiding miles of submerged tunnels, chambers, and breathtaking limestone passageways. But beneath its calm surface lies a maze that has tested even the most seasoned divers. On November 4, 2014, two experienced cave divers, Ryan McCombs and Mark Dudas,
entered Jackson Blue for what was supposed to be a routine scooter dive. Both were highly trained and well acquainted with the complexities of Florida's aquifer system. Their goal was to execute a deep penetration into the cave using diver propulsion vehicles, which allow for faster travel and extended exploration. Their gear was top of the line. Between the side mount configurations, stage bottles, and powerful scooters, they were prepared for a long and demanding dive. Years of training and preparation backed every move. But even elite divers can fall victim to the cave's unforgiving nature. As they navigated through the system and approached the trash room, a known junction, they missed a critical left turn that would have kept them on the main Gold Line route. Instead, they inadvertently entered the Rabbit Hole Bypass, a highly silty, restrictive side passage known for being extremely dangerous. This route is not meant for scooters, and any movement within it risks kicking up sediment that can obliterate visibility in seconds. Once inside, the passage narrowed rapidly, forcing the divers into tight spaces that made maneuvering their scooters nearly impossible. As expected, the silt was disturbed, and the tunnel quickly filled with a thick cloud, plunging the divers into complete blackness. Ryan McCombs ended up deeper in the rabbit hole, completely surrounded by the silt out. He became disoriented and trapped, unable to see the line or navigate backward safely. Mark Dudas, who had stayed closer to the opening, realized what was happening and managed to back out into clearer water. Recognizing the danger, Mark decided to abort the dive and surface, following cave diving protocol. Never compound a mistake or endanger two lives when help can be summoned. Top cave rescue diver Ed Sorensen was called immediately. Known throughout the diving world for his calm under pressure and razor-sharp navigation skills, Ed responded quickly. But in an unexpected turn, Ryan McCombs managed to save himself. Drawing on his extensive training, he remembered an emergency gas cache stashed deep inside the cave, placed there by other divers as a precautionary measure. Ryan located the bottle and used it to buy himself more time. With slow, methodical movements, he began backing out through the silt, inch by inch. The darkness was suffocating, and one wrong kick could have undone all his progress. But Ryan didn't panic. He made it back to the clearer water, eventually reaching a zone where natural light began to seep in from the cavern entrance. It was there that Ed Sorensen met him. Though Ed had suited up for a full rescue, Ryan had already done the impossible, navigated out of a blackout in a deadly passage, using nothing but his training, composure, and sheer will. Ed guided him the final distance to the surface, where Ryan emerged shaken but alive. No one died that day, but it came uncomfortably close. The dive became a landmark case in cave diving circles, illustrating how even top-tier divers can fall prey to disorientation, and how preparedness, composure, and emergency planning can mean the difference between life and death. It also underscored the importance of gas staging, clear navigation, and never relying solely on memory or familiarity in a system as complex as Jackson Blue. For McCombs and Dudas, it was a turning point. Both would continue to dive, but with a renewed reverence for the invisible razor's edge they had crossed. For the diving community, it was a sobering reminder. Even the best can get lost. And sometimes, survival hinges not on brute strength, but on calm, deliberate action in the darkest possible moment. But this incident had backup bottles, dive computers, or elite rescuers waiting nearby. However, in this next story, all they had was a flashlight and luck. On a cold Sunday in January 1995, 25-year-old Clinton Farrell entered a cave in rural Tennessee, chasing a quiet thrill. Alongside a friend, he stepped into Cookston Cave, a spot buried deep in Sequatchie County. It wasn't a tourist cave. There were no guided tours, no safety warnings, and no support ropes. Just two young men with a flashlight and a sense of curiosity. They weren't professional cavers, just locals with a passion for exploring, drawn by the murmur of old stories, maybe rumors of Civil War artifacts or something else lost to time. Whatever the reason, they went underground that morning with little preparation and even less margin for error. At first, the cave seemed passive. Cold air, dripping water, tight passageways. It was manageable. But caves are deceptive. They lull you into a sense of control, until something shifts, until something goes wrong. And something did. Deep inside Cookston Cave, Clinton crawled through a tight passage. As he maneuvered forward, a 500-pound slab of rock shifted. Just slightly, but enough to slam downward and pin his head against the wall. 1 second he was moving forward, the next he was stuck, trapped by the crushing weight of solid limestone. There was no moving, no twisting out. The rock had him. His friend, stunned, panicked, tried to help but quickly realized he couldn't lift the stone. And there was no signal, no way to call for help underground. The only option was to leave Clinton behind and crawl his way back through the darkness. Outside, he called for emergency services, launching one of the most difficult cave rescues in Tennessee's recent history. Within hours, specialized rescue teams from Sequatchie and Hamilton counties arrived on the scene. These weren't ordinary firefighters, they were trained cave responders. They moved in with minimal gear, careful not to dislodge anything else in the unstable environment. Cookston Cave had already shifted once. It could happen again. The rock that trapped Clinton wasn't just heavy, it was deadly. It pinned him in place at a precarious angle. Even the smallest wrong move could cause further injury, or worse, bring down more rock from the ceiling above. The rescuers stabilized the slab, then brought in a come-along, a hand-powered winch that could shift enormous weight with extreme precision. For hours, they worked in absolute silence, slowly turning the crank, millimeter by millimeter, trying to move the rock without bringing the whole ceiling down. It took nearly 5 hours to free him.
Once the slab was moved, Clinton was barely conscious. He was in critical condition, but alive. Rescuers carefully loaded him into a litter and then began the next impossible task, hauling him up a 100-foot incline inside the cave, where footing was uncertain and space was tight. Every foot of that climb was a battle. Rescuers passed ropes, braced their bodies, and moved inch by inch until finally Clinton saw daylight again. On the surface, a medical team was already waiting. He was airlifted to the hospital, still in critical shape, but doctors believed he would pull through. The rock that nearly ended his life hadn't won, not this time. But the message was clear. Caves don't give second chances easily. Clinton Farrell was lucky to have survived the crushing force. Luckily, his friend didn't panic. Lucky, the right rescuers came, and came fast. Cookston Cave didn't collapse that day, but it didn't have to. It only needed one moment, one unstable slab, one wrong move. And in the world of cave exploration, that's all it ever takes. But what happens when you're alone underwater, and time runs out before anyone even knows you're missing?
On July 25th, 2015, it was supposed to be a day of adventure, a break from routine, a dive into paradise. 20-year-old airman Drew Bellairs had no idea that the waters beneath Guam's jungle held something else, a silent trap. Marbo Cave wasn't on any official map. No safety signs, no lifeguards, just word of mouth and whispers of its beauty. Some called it magical, glassy water beneath jagged rock, veiled in jungle, fed by an underground aquifer. But others knew the truth. Beneath that still surface, the cave twisted and narrowed into tight underwater tunnels. No visibility, no air pockets. Originally from Osage, Iowa, Drew was quiet but fearless, the kind of kid who would dive into freezing rivers on a dare, laughing the whole way. Now stationed with the Iowa Air National Guard on Guam, he was adjusting to military life, the thick island heat, and the rhythm of duty. When someone mentioned Marbo Cave, a hidden freshwater pool, tucked into limestone cliffs on the remote side of Mangalao, Drew didn't hesitate. He said yes, without blinking. Drew and a few friends made their way down the slippery rocks, laughing and joking as they approached the pool. The water was cool, blue, and clear, shimmering like a secret. Drew dove in without pause. He was a natural swimmer, used to holding his breath. Exploring the underwater tunnel system felt like the next challenge. But beneath the surface, the world changed. The cave wound in unnatural directions. Passages narrowed. Some were only shoulder wide. Others dropped off suddenly, offering no return path. And Drew was breath-hold diving. No tank, no safety line, no backup.
At some point in that darkness, he didn't come back up. At first, his friends thought he was just exploring, but seconds dragged into minutes. They shouted his name, dove back in, checked every surface. Nothing. Panic bloomed fast. They scrambled up the rocks and through the jungle, crashing through vines, yelling for help. But Guam's terrain wasn't easy, and cell service was unreliable at best. By the time they reached help, the clock had already ticked too long. Emergency teams rushed to the scene, trained military divers equipped for confined space underwater search. This wasn't a beach rescue. It was a cave recovery. They moved quickly but carefully, threading through the tunnels with lights slicing through total blackness. They knew what they were looking for. They also knew what they were likely to find.
Navigating Marbo Cave underwater is like crawling through a pitch-black maze with no floor and no ceiling. Visibility is near zero. There's no room to turn around in some places. No air to speak of. The divers had to feel their way, guided only by their training and the narrow beam of a headlamp. They found Drew deep inside, still, silent, and unresponsive. The water hadn't been rough. There had been no warning signs. But he had made one wrong turn, or simply stayed under too long. That's all it takes.
Back at the surface, his friends waited in stunned silence. The cave that had looked so peaceful just hours before had turned into a grave. Drew's body was recovered and later flown home to Iowa, a trip that was meant to be a birthday celebration. He would have turned 21 in just a few days. Instead, his fellow airmen at Anderson Air Force Base gathered in quiet formation. There were no words to make sense of it, just grief and silence. News of Drew's death spread across Guam, the military, and back home in Osage. People couldn't believe it. Drew was strong, brave, smart, and the water had looked so calm. But caves don't always show you their danger, not until it's too late. Marbo Cave still draws swimmers and thrill seekers every year. Its surface is just as beautiful, blue, glassy, inviting. But beauty doesn't cancel out danger. For those who know Drew's story, Marbo Cave is no longer just a hidden gem. It's a haunting reminder that in places like this, wonder and death can live side by side, separated only by a breath you don't make it back to take. If stories like these make your heart pound, hit subscribe and ring the bell, because once you step inside, there is no way out.